Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again in another essay discussion of Ayn Rand. Today's essay is The Chicken's Homecoming. So, James, what is this essay about? And could you give us the basic setup that Rand based to writing this essay?
Well, this essay was first appeared in the in a 1970 edition of her magazine, The Objectivist, and it was later reprinted in The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution, and again in the expanded edition of that, Return of the Primitive, edited by Peter Schwartz. In 1970, she was sort of looking back on the meeting of the American Philosophical Association in December of 1969. Now, the American Philosophical Association in December of 1969 came together and met and had a fiery, for an academic professional association, they had a fiery debate that caused, literally strong emotions were expressed there between academic philosophers, the many thousands of academic philosophers that belonged to the group, about the Vietnam War. In 1969, by the end of 1969, when the APA met, the Vietnam War was largely criticized in America, both from the right and the left. Years earlier had been criticizing the Vietnam War. In 1967, she made it a central part of her Ford Hall Forum speech in The Wreckage of the Consensus. In 1968, such moderate voices as the newscaster Walter Cronkite were denouncing the war. Richard Nixon, running for president in 1968, promised to get us out of the Vietnam War, and that's probably what sunk the Democrats' chances in that year, as the Democrat Lyndon Johnson, the president, couldn't run for re-election because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. So being against the Vietnam War by the time the APA met at the end of 1969 was yawn uncontroversial. Most people were opposed to it. So the radicals, so basically the setup was like this. A group of radicals in the American Philosophical Association came up with a proposal that denounced the Vietnam War, but denounced it in nakedly Marxist terms. It not only said America should immediately withdraw from Vietnam, but it said it denounced American foreign policy as being nothing but a tool of American free enterprise, for example. It thoroughly denounced foreign aid, America's foreign aid, as interfering with the rebellion that we want to see breaking out in the third world, and so it was rank Marxism in the justification it gave for its opposition to the Vietnam War. A large group of conservatives stood up and said, "No, we oppose that Marxist language," and they opposed the whole proposal. But then someone stood up. And ironically, irony of ironies, it was the graduate student of one of the conservative professors who said, "I have a compromise. Let's cut out all the Marxist middle paragraphs that do the justification for our denunciation and leave just the first and last paragraphs that say we should get out, as soon as possible." And that was the resolution that was adopted by the American Philosophical Association. Some people perceived it to be a victory for the conservatives, but the author of the compromise that won immediately wrote to the New York Times saying, no, it was a victory for the moderate left. Ayn Rand tears apart that disgraceful moment in the American Philosophical Association's history on several grounds. The New York Times article, for example, that she quotes, that discussed this meeting, accurately to some degree described what was going on. It said, on the one hand, you've got a bunch of philosophers who thought that the role of philosophy should be to train minds, advance thought, by dispassionately remaining aloof from the issues of the day, versus the radicals who thought that, of course, and they have a perfectly good point, that philosophy has completely become irrelevant, completely lost touch with the issues of the day. It was philosophers only talking to other philosophers in this sterile, discussion that has nothing to do with reality. And so they were in favor of the relevance of and the importance of philosophy taking a stand on an issue, so important an issue as America's war in Vietnam. And what in effect happened is that this theory-practice dichotomy, those over here who thought that, well, it's just about training minds, now, how do you train minds without any content? And those over here who say we need to take political stands, but forget all that theory, we don't need that, we can adopt the thing anyway. What you end up doing is, in effect, as Ayn Rand describes it, it is a statement that philosophy has died from unemployment. And there's really no other way of looking at it. You've cut out all the theoretical foundations that you'd think a philosopher would be most concerned about, is the theoretical foundation, not the outcome position, but the theoretical foundations of it. If philosophy has abdicated that, philosophy is dead. It is completely sterile, and she performs here what she describes as an autopsy. I think that's the best word for it, autopsy.
It, when I went through uni, through the philosophers of, especially the ones on the Enlightenment, one of the things that I liked the most was going through the way in which they used what they had developed in epistemology and ethics to give an idea of how governments should be made. And I mean, you could have crazy people like Rousseau or Hobbes, but I really appreciated like the way in which they went over a whole theoretical framework to answer these kind of issues.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
when I went a bit modern, it was so boring.
Boring.
Even Kelsen, it was
Oh,
so boring.
yeah. No, the closer you get to the 20th century, the worse it gets. And then the 20th century, it's like, are they even doing philosophy in the sense that John Locke or even John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer were doing? Certainly nothing like the Enlightenment philosophers like, Ron Herbert or John Locke or even earlier Hugo Grotius. You're right. Locke, for example, based his critique of slavery and his defense of rights and property rights on a natural law orientation that he basically got from Aristotle and the natural law theorists who'd come before him. You're absolutely right. Outside of this wider philosophical framework, I mean, that's what philosophers are doing. They're giving us the philosophical framework, the basis, the foundation on which we can answer these political questions. Absolutely. So in that sense, political philosophy is almost died. In the United States, there was a sort of revival of serious political philosophy to some degree in the 1970s with the Rawls-Nozick debate. Two important Harvard philosophy professors both wrote books about political philosophy, one trying to revive the Lockean idea and another trying to defend egalitarianism. And so it didn't completely die. There was still some relevance to political philosophy, but only after, it is interesting to note, Ayn Rand wrote here.
Now let's talk about probably the intellectual, which has been mostly taken granted over the last 120 years, and that is Marx. And basically, she says that the idea of that it's even worse to take away the Marxist theoretical framework than leave the conclusions, but without the theoretical framework. Why does she think that?
Oh, well, as she points out, the original form that the radicals had proposed was far more honest, far more sincere and straightforward, also more philosophical, doing more what a philosopher should do in terms of providing honestly their theoretical framework. When a philosopher gives you his theoretical basis, when he gives you the reasons why, his ethical, his political, and ultimately his epistemological basis for telling you why he comes to the position he is, he's giving you the chance to decide for yourself. Do you agree or disagree? To what extent you agree or disagree with the reasons why he got there? When you cut out all that theoretical stuff, you're actually cutting out all the real work that philosophy is all about, rendering it, in effect, philosophically bankrupt.
And don't you think that it has a relationship with the current world? And I'm thinking that there are several laws. I think this is very common in Europe, but probably it's very common in the rest of the world, where you have crazy laws, like laws that say the craziest, most awful things, but only because the judicial is somewhat worthful. Like we don't live in a dictatorship. I am thinking more specifically about the libel law here in the UK, which is crazy. Everything could be libelous.
Yes.
Don't you think that that's a pattern? Yeah,
Yes.
that's libel, James.
Yes.
uh, So,
I don't mean to libel Great Britain's legal system.
um, okay, we're back. Sorry for the intermission. Hope you could have coffee in the meantime. So, James, let us go. Sorry, we were in the middle of of today's world, specifically the way in which politics behaves. Do you think that this is a common pattern in, well, we're going to create crazy laws, but then we will give that to the judiciary or the executive to make sense of that?
Very much so. Absolutely. You know, what's really interesting, Ayn Rand points out in this essay so brilliantly, is that it's not what we see here with philosophers, we see played out in politics all the time. So the left will come up with some proposal straight out of the Communist Manifesto. Well, let's have, we have to have health care, we have to have retirement insurance, we have to have dot 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 straight out of communist literature. And the conservatives will agree to the basic point. They'll concede the outcome. Yes, okay, well, we need to have retirement insurance and we need to have health care for everyone and dot dot dot. But they'll cut out, but we don't want all this Marxist theory, all this Marxist theorizing that goes with it. So we'll for political purposes, we'll compromise. And that basically means we compromise on the end, which is exactly what the left wants. Now, of course, once we get that through, let everyone figure out whether it's constitutional in Great Britain or the United States or wherever else it is, consistent with our traditions and constitution and laws. That is exactly how they go about it. And that shows, again, the bankruptcy of philosophy. Rather than taking on the philosophical issue, rather than taking on the political and therefore ethical and therefore epistemological issues that would be required to address this issue, they sidestep that, basically conceding it, or worse, saying it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. Absolutely.
Now, let me go back to the political science as political science, because I want to talk about something a bit more positive to make the contrast. And she talks about political science at its best, and also she also says that it's earlier that we think. Why do people need political science, and why is it earlier than we think?
Well, politics is a branch of philosophy which Ayn Rand regarded as absolutely indispensable, no matter what your field of study is, no matter what we're trying to figure out. Politics is the political philosophy in her mind, is the study of the principles for the proper social organization of human beings. And of course, that has to be based, as she explains, on a more fundamental topic, ethics, which discusses the values and principles which are appropriate to guide man's choices and actions. And of course, in turn, as she explained elsewhere in the article, that's based upon more fundamental disciplines, epistemology and metaphysics, which set the methodology for how we'll even decide these issues. And human beings, as she points out, cannot live without a philosophical frame of reference. Even when we were largely ignorant in the most primitive stages of human development, we needed some kind of philosophy, and that's why we needed religion. But unfortunately, religion is a bunch of mystical speculation in the arbitrary, and that created problems in human history that we had to overcome. And that really points to the necessity of rational philosophy. We cannot do without philosophy. We cannot do without ethical and epistemological guidance, precisely because of the issues of the day, because we need guidance in the area of politics. How should we organize our society? How should we organize our government? In order to answer those questions, we need the discipline of philosophy. And so at its best, as she said, at its best, it requires the best in men. It requires the best in human thought. And this is vital. Issues, as she points out, like the Vietnam War, could tremendously benefit from the input of philosophers. There's no question. Philosophers are the ones who have the tools and the vocabulary and the discipline to give us the fundamentals to help us understand these issues. dividing philosophy, for example, between those who are interested in the issues of the day with no theoretical basis and those who are only interested in training minds aloof from the issues of the day, divorce those two, and in fact tell us that the one is irrelevant to the other. That is exactly the opposite direction we should be going in. We should be going in the integrating direction where we use epistemology and ethics to help us answer political questions. And that is the distinct power of philosophy and the inescapable power of philosophy.
Now, one of the most interesting passages of this essay is when she talks about her view of philosophical development in history. And you already talked about religion, but could you talk a bit more about Greece?
Yes, she basically says Greece marks the moment when humans emerge from their childhood. Really, if the human race can be analogized to a human life, before the Greeks, we were children and infants. We really didn't know what we were talking about. The Greeks self-consciously developed methodology of thought, logic. And here the great hero is Aristotle, although some of his predecessors and successors also are big heroes in this department. But the Greeks basically developed the self-conscious discipline of logic. And so now we start having an objective methodology, or at least the starts of an objective methodology of philosophy and how to answer questions in general. And so in Ayn Rand's mind, there is a huge demarcation. She cuts a lot of slack for pre-Greek human beings because they really didn't know better. But human beings have the capacity to get to where the Greeks got to, this self-conscious awareness of philosophy as an important topic. And that really is the achievement of the Greeks. And of course, when Greco-Roman civilization collapsed, that kind of approach to thinking died with it, to be replaced by a dark age in which Christian thought dominated. And well, if Christian thought is sort of oxymoronic, right? In which the Christian suppression of thought dominated Western civilization. And it was only with Aquinas and his era of scholastics that reestablished the importance of Greek thinking and reintroduced Aristotle and the best of Greek thought back into European thinking in the High Middle Ages, which led, of course, to humanism, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, modern science. Ayn Rand even praises, and this many people might find it surprising, that she even praises men, not just Aristotle and Aquinas, but men like Plato and Spinoza. I think she probably would have included to some degree perhaps Locke, not his epistemology, but perhaps aspects of his politics, as being sincere. They weren't perfect for all their errors, for all the rationalism of Plato and Spinoza, for all of Locke's veil of perception nonsense, right? At least they were sincere thinkers who were honestly trying to deploy reason to answer important questions. She believes that an important line of demarcation begins in the late Enlightenment with Hume, and especially with Kant. Hume was basically just cashing in on the errors of his predecessors, the Cartesian and Lockean epistemological mistakes. And he was basically drawing out the implications of those mistakes and cashing in on them in a massive skeptical way. And in this way, she compares them to Bertrand Russell, the Bertrand Russell of his time. Whereas Kant actually created a system, a positive system, which argued that the means of human consciousness were themselves distorting factors that separated us from reality, rather than getting them in touch with reality, and an ethics that was not based on the needs of human life on Earth at all, but some kind of rationalistic construct of this, doctrine of duty that has nothing to do with consequences. So in Ayn Rand's mind, it was the construction of this system of thought that brought an end really to whatever good start the Enlightenment had, whatever sincere start at least the Enlightenment had in philosophy. And philosophy since Kant has been a downhill thing since, really. Just got worse and worse.
Do you think that some people like John Rawls or sorry, I forgot the name of his
Robert Nozick
counterpart. Nozick would be on the more sincere part of their theories?
I think I might put Robert Nozick on the more sincere side of that I don't agree with his. I mean, his derivation is very weak. It's thin, and it's a very rationalistic sort of defense. But in his own terms, I think at least at that moment, I might regard Professor Nozick's approach as an honest one. I'm not sure the same could be said about Rawls's, although Rawls at least was an attempt to give philosophical. I mean, he's obviously using Kantian means, this veil of perception and so forth. He's obviously ending up with a very egalitarian policy conclusion. And Ayn Rand, as we've discussed earlier, dispassionately took that John Rawls's theory of justice apart mercilessly, bit by bit. But nonetheless, at least the debate between Nozick and Rawls was an attempt to get back at abstract political philosophy in a serious way that hadn't really been seen in some time.
Now, you've already mentioned on how people would have gotten a great value from a philosopher explaining the war in Vietnam. Could you update this comment with the developments that we have seen in 2020, 21, 2022?
Well, aren't we faced with a very similar kind of situation? One of the complaints Ayn Rand had about what the American Philosophical Association ended up agreeing to in their compromise resolution was a one-sided denunciation of America's military tactics, a one-sided denunciation of America without an exploration of the evils of communist aggression, the tactics of the Viet Cong. Instead of addressing that, which you'd think any fair analysis of the matter would have to have included. Now, Ayn Rand did not think that even that would justify America's intervention in Vietnam. In other words, she thought that that was simply the result of altruism, the philosophy that's shared by both the radicals and the conservatives at the APA. If they'd done the proper analysis of politics and ethics and epistemology, like her, they would have realized that the Vietnam War was wrong because it was asking young Americans to go die in sacrifice where Americans had no national interest. And then you can see the analog here. We have to be very, very careful in being able to say, yeah, Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine. There's no question they're the bad guys. They're the dictatorship, as we discussed earlier. Dictatorship is the cause of war, says Ayn Rand. And they're the dictatorship who started this aggressive war, which is now killing women and children. Russia is the bad guy. Now, does that in itself answer the question as to whether or not America or Great Britain has sufficient interest to defend Ukraine when it's just a war in Ukraine? What are the interests of the West? Should we be engaged in some altruistic defense of Ukraine? Now, my heart bleeds for the people of Ukraine right now, who are the victims of naked aggression, it seems to me. But on the other hand, is that in itself sufficient justification to say that the West should immediately intervene and send troops to or create a no-fly zone over, which is what brave President Zelensky is asking for. He's asking for a no-fly zone. Two separate questions: who the bad guy is, right? As we would have said in Vietnam, the communist aggressors and invaders. That's one thing. That is a separate issue as to whether or not the West should get involved and to what extent. And that depends on our analysis of our own interests. The United States and Great Britain must respect their own interests when they decide whether or not to send troops or create a no-fly zone, or to what extent they're going to help Ukraine, even though the Russians are the bad guys. So there's a perfect analogy here between Ayn Rand's, say, position on the Vietnam War, which she utterly denounced. But on the other hand, she was also disgusted that the American Philosophical Association had a completely one-sided take on America's evil and the military tactics that America was taking. First, philosophers are not military tacticians. And while the goals of the Vietnam War, or the morality and the general sense of the Vietnam War, are philosophical issues, military tactics is well beyond the professional scope of a philosopher in her mind.
Now, maybe a natural question would be, I think many philosophers realize that this is an incredible power, the power to explain things. Yet what they do is they don't even keep quiet. They confuse people. They give them extremely wrong normative rules. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think that they resort to that kind of thinking?
Well, first, the thing is, it's inevitable if you don't have a solid epistemological foundation, if you aren't clear about your principles and your values when you come into it, you're sort of setting yourself up for a nonsensical policy position. I think we can predict that very frequently they're going to come up with very bad ideas. But there's still something worse at play here. And you can see it here in the meeting, and this compromise. It's as if the theory doesn't matter at all. When I come up with some crazy proposition, and then I say, well, philosophy could come to philosophy isn't what's going to solve this problem. You see, what I've done is I've divorced philosophical thought from any kind of practical policy outcomes. And that's exactly the theory practice dichotomy that they've set up here. So if I give you an absurd, it's beautiful setup, isn't it? If I give you an absurd policy position and I don't provide a detailed theoretical foundation for it, then in effect what I'm saying is theory doesn't matter. Go by your feelings, go by the seat of your pants, be a pragmatist, be an emotionalist. Theory is irrelevant. They are in effect declaring the bankruptcy of their own profession, philosophy.
Now, Rand thinks that a major part of the guilt belongs to conservatives. Do you think that has gotten worse, at least in American sense? Do you think that they have become more pragmatist or less theoretical?
Yes, yes. I am very sorry to say that in the course of my lifetime, what I have witnessed from the 1970s here up to the 2020s in the course of my lifetime is an ever declining interest in principles. The lip service that conservatives once gave, at least to aspects of the free market, are gone. You look at President Trump, one of the least principled Republican presidents. Nixon was a pragmatist, but I think he was beat by Donald Trump, who basically threw in free trade, who basically conceded the labor union's point about immigration, stealing jobs. And so what we saw was, it seems to me, a far more nakedly pragmatic Republican Party under Trump, and even disturbingly more authoritarian. The lip service to individual rights and the founding fathers, at least that the previous Republicans had given them, was gone from Trump's nomenclature. So I think it's only gotten worse among conservatives, much worse. They're more pragmatic, they're more authoritarian, they're more outcome-oriented without any thought of a need for a theoretical foundation.
That's yeah. Here they're pretty crazy as well. So why does she argue that no professional organization should have an ideological stance in name of its members?
Well, many of the professional organizations in America are meant to be simply professional organizations that discuss the internal professional problems of the business. For example, I was a lawyer licensed attorney for almost 20 years. I was a licensed attorney, but I did not I belonged to my state bar to be a licensed lawyer, but I would not belong to the American Bar Association, the biggest national organization of lawyers in this country, because they took all kinds of specific political positions on all manner of issues that I did not agree with, nor did I want to belong to an organization that would take all manner of specific positions on all manner of issues. It doesn't speak for me. And an organization that claims to speak for an entire profession has no business taking positions like this at all. At all. Ayn Rand points out that philosophers had a lot to contribute to this debate. Individual philosophers, maybe distinct philosophical schools, but the American Philosophical Association, which is supposed to speak for all academic philosophers in America, should not be taking these stands because they don't speak. The fiery debate here in 1969 reveals that they didn't have a unified position on it. So what the heck are they doing speaking for all philosophers in that sense? they have no business doing so. I would not belong to such a professional organization. You see it in all kinds of professional organizations. The American Medical Association, for example, takes all kinds of political positions that they have no business. And you know that American physicians have a wide range of opinions on these issues, but nonetheless, the APA takes positions, or the AMA takes positions on all kinds of medical issues that they have no business taking a position on. They are not speaking for all medical doctors and physicians in my country.
I think the latest scandal is that they are saying that they're changing the language. Is that right? That they're changing
Right.
the whole.
Oh, pronouns are a big thing today. They would hate it if I start using, he is a generalized pronoun for the people in general or something, man or mankind. And of course, obviously, I'm a primitive antediluvian sexist simply in using that language.
And talking about Marxist language, I think they were saying something like, there's no poverty, there's just ripping off people or something like that.
Right, exploitation, right.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So James, I'm approaching to the last question. So, and I think this one may be the most important in the context of the end, which is how powerful is the capacity for offering a normative theory?
Well, that's exactly it. When you say that the world of, well, David Hume, he said you can't derive an ought from an is. No normative statement could ever be objectively derived from a fact statement. That's that. And philosophers have been in uniform agreement with David Hume pretty much ever since. And Ayn Rand is, of course, the great standout. Ayn Rand is the one who said, no. Normative science values can be objective, and therefore normative sciences can be placed on a perfectly objective footing if we understand what values are, what their objective place in reality is, right? It's basically part of our biological nature that we pursue values. And in grounding values objectively, Ayn Rand has opened up she has restored the objectivity, in effect, of normative fields like ethics and politics and aesthetics and economics and history. I mean, all of these are, in effect, normative sciences. And, and if you don't make evaluative conclusions in these sciences, you're not really doing those sciences. And so it is of enormous importance. If I can't do politics or economics or ethics without some kind of normative policy conclusion that I can rely on in some objective way, then it's just your feelings versus mine, your gang versus mine. Who's got the bigger gang, the bigger clubs, is what it boils down to. And that's, in effect, what philosophers have said. That all normative matters boil down to the purely subjective. Either it's just intrinsically given by God if you're a religious person, or if you're like most modern secular academics, it's totally subjective and skeptical.
Thank you, James. And
sure.
Just to be more optimistic, she talks about how a very small clique of people was able to move and change how the outcome of 7,000 people change. Can we make the same if we are consistent?
History is made by minorities, sometimes for the horrible bad and sometimes for the remarkable good. But history is made by minorities who catch on and to which the others have no good answer. And so they have the certainty, they have the moral high ground, and at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to win. It's the consistent voice, it's the morally confident voice. And if you're logically consistent and morally confident, you're on the winning end of it. You're on the, as they say, the right side of history. And this is true whether I agree with your ideas or not. It's that certainty. It's that clarity and certainty. It's that moral confidence, that moral high ground that really is the indicator of where human history is going.
Thank you very much, James.
Sure.
So before we leave, let me thank Theresa for her very generous contribution. Thank you very much. And thank you, James, for another wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. Sorry for the interruption, but this was another good one.
Definitely. Maybe we can create an intermezzo.
An
Little
intermezzo,
naming.
exactly. Little musical interlude for the. But if you haven't subscribed to the Ayn Rand Center UK, you may want to consider definitely doing that. We to keep the lights on around here in doing what I regard as important work in creating an international community aware of the work of objectivist philosophers like Ayn Rand, Leonard Peikoff, and Harry Binswanger. We are doing invaluable work. If you enjoy the content of these kind of discussions, and there's more. There's all kinds of added perks if you become a regular monthly subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK, Don Watkins Communication Boot Camp. On Sundays, I help lead a workshop where we study Leonard Peikoff courses on epistemology, and those are just some of the benefits you get. So please hit like, subscribe, share, comment, and if you find this content of value, please become a subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK.